Hey everyone, as promised, here's part 2 of the updates to the DPS meta in the Final Shape DLC. This video should be a lot shorter than the weapons one since there are way less abilities to cover, both new and old. Today we're going to be going over supers, grenades, melees, and tick sources or buddies. Let's start with supers. Before we get into the thick of things, I wanted to talk about some unique super interactions and combos that I thought were of note. First up, we have Star Eater Scales swapping. For those unaware, the way Star Eater Scales works is that it provides a 70% buff to super damage as soon as you cast your super for a set duration, long enough to outlast most supers. On some supers with some sort of duration extension, you'll actually see your numbers take a hit towards the end of the super, but that's not what we care about in this particular instance. The more important part of this quirk is that the buff stays applied to your character, even if you swap off the exotic after casting your super. This allows for some interesting effects where you can have the effects of both Star Eater Scales and another exotic applied to your super at the same time. Before the Final Shape launch, the only real interesting interactions with this effect were with Radiant Flux and with Shards of Galanor. With the former, you could boost your Arc Staff's damage by 70% while also getting the on-hit duration and damage amp effects of Synapse Junction stacking. With the latter, players doing certain solo challenges would cast Blade Barrage and then swap to Galanor, allowing them to get a full 70% boosted Blade Barrage while getting half of it back from Galanor's effect, thus enabling them to get possibly 2 Blade Barrages per damage phase. While I did test the Radiant Flux interaction for damage, it's not actually very good. Arc Staff is an inherently low DPS super that is mostly designed around PvP, and even with a 70% and 46% buff stack, it still struggles to output competitive DPS, sitting at just under 60,000. For reference, that's worse DPS than a Vortex Grenade's DOT effect or a Rocket Sidearm with Vorpal. While it does result in a rather high 1.1 million total damage, taking almost 19 seconds to do that damage means that this combo, while interesting, is a non-starter for optimal DPS. But what about Prismatic? Not only did Prismatic bring the 70% damage boost from starters to every class, not just Hunter, but there's a whole host of additional effects like Syntheseps in the mix. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Syntheseps doesn't inherit its 50% super damage bonus from the Titan version, and unfortunately the class item version of Star Eaters also behaves differently than the normal Hunter exotic. Remember that persistence effect we talked about where you can keep the 70% buff even after swapping off the exotic? Not only does that not work on the class item version, but even swapping off Prismatic wipes the buff from your character entirely. That means that no Star Eater Syntho swaps on Titan can happen, and no popping Needlestorm on Prismatic with Star Eater and swapping to Broodweaver for Threat of Evolution. In both these scenarios, the super acts like Star Eater was never there to begin with. While this might be considered a shame to some, it probably would have been pretty bad for game balance if Titans, for example, were allowed to pop on Star Eaters and then swap to Syntheseps for a 70% and 50% stackable boost to some pretty already decent supers. Another cool quirk I wanted to talk about is something I've been suspecting since the launch of this DLC, but haven't gotten around to testing until recently. As far as I'm aware, I don't think anyone has tried this, but as some of you know, Well of Radiance converts the caster's weapon damage to super damage of the same type of the weapon you're shooting. So if you cast your Well and then start shooting Thunderlord, for a variety of interactions in this game, you're doing arc super damage, like a Chaos Reach would be classified. Prismatic has a fragment called Facet of Courage that boosts light ability damage by 10% against targets that are darkness debuffed. You see where this is going? Anyways, I discovered that if you place your Well, swap the Prismatic with this fragment, and do light weapon damage, all of it is boosted by 10% if the boss you're shooting is darkness debuffed, as expected. This would actually be a really strong interaction if Well wasn't changed a couple years back so that it only converts its caster's damage to super damage instead of anyone that steps in it. Regardless, still some pretty cool tech, and if we ever get a light weapon that's really strong on Warlock in particular, that's a free extra 10% that stacks with everything, for the Wellcaster in particular. For now, that 10% definitely won't overshadow the over 1 million damage that a Star Eater Nova does up front, but still pretty cool. Finally, one last thing before we talk about actual supers themselves. Some of you might remember people testing Phoenix Cradle with a variety of other supers. As a reminder, this Titan exotic allows you to share Soul Invictus with your teammates, which reduces their passive super drain by 40%, in addition to a couple other positive benefits. While this was typically used with Chaos Reach and Geomag stabilizers, since that super's whole concept is about passive drain, I decided to test it with a couple other supers this season. Specifically, I chose Daybreak, Song of Flame, and Glacial Quake as testing candidates to see how much Phoenix Cradle sunspots change their total damage. As a baseline, Chaos Reach with Geomags gets approximately 52% more total damage with Soul Invictus, going from just over 900k damage to almost 1.4 million. Now, Phoenix Cradle obviously doesn't change DPS values, it only extends your super duration, so I didn't measure the DPS of any of these supers with Soul Invictus active. So what are the new total values? Daybreak with Dawn Chorus gets an 11% boost, Song of Flame gets a 6.5% boost, and other supers that I tested like Glacial Quake where active drain is a major component barely had their damage change. Overall, a cool experiment, but nothing too fruitful came of it. Now, on to the good stuff. Before we talk about the supers that we all know and love, let's talk about the 3 new supers introduced with the final shape. First, Song of Flame. This super has been the topic of many discussions this season, no doubt thanks to its many useful features. Let's go through what it does. First, it gives the caster Radiant while the super is active, which means it's great for solo content since it lasts for almost the same duration as a well if you don't use any of its damaging abilities. It also gives the caster 90% DR and allies 30% DR, which is also excellent for damage scenarios. I'm sure you've all seen solo and fireteam GM runs where players using Star Eater Song of Flame become effectively unkillable while face tanking a GM boss and its melee attacks. On top of this, Song of Flame provides you and your allies with Scorching Rounds. While this is probably the least useful part of this super, it does give certain weapons a bit of a boost, like Dragon's Breath, Ergos Sum, and Microcosm, since it's a kinetic weapon and those get Scorching Rounds for some reason. The other component of Song of Flame is the fact that, of course, you can do damage with the super itself too. Obviously, this cuts into your ability to keep that 30% DR uptime going, as well as the Apotheosis-like ability regen you provide your teammates, but in a pinch, this thing actually isn't bad when it comes to DPS. A bunch of people have asked me to test a variety of factors that affect the super's damage, from the combo being used to the armor exotic pairing. Let's start with the optimal combo for Song of Flame damage. First, I'm sure you've already seen this, but Song of Flame's Wisp or Little Firebird does very little damage compared to its melee. As a result, just spamming Wisp is pretty bad for damage. On the other hand, spamming the Cone Snap is higher total damage than spamming both, but since you can't spam it at max rate since the recharge isn't high enough, the DPS ends up being quite low. Perhaps using it in conjunction with Dragon's Breath or another weapon between each snap might be an idea that pans out. However, if you want to use the super for raw DPS, then starting with a snap and alternating between snaps and wisps is the way to go. I also tried using the Celestial Fire 5 projectile melee, but it ended up being significantly worse than the Incinerator snap version. The former isn't even available on Prismatic anyways, but I was curious. As for exotic armor pairings, there were 3 that people wanted me to test: Verity's Brow, Dawn Chorus, and Solipsism with Spirit of the Star Eater. Of the 3, it wasn't even close. Dawn Chorus yielded a total damage value of 1.1 million, Verity's was around 1.42 million since its effect only buffs the Wisp, the much weaker component of your super's damage, and finally, Star Eaters managed to drop 1.66 million damage in 14 seconds, resulting in a DPS value of around 116k. Now, if you've been following my damage projects at all, you know that that's not a particularly impressive value, worse than almost every meta special and certainly worse than every meta heavy. That being said, with Facet of Courage, this super is easily the highest total damage super in the game outside of Star Eater Glacial Quake, which requires rather specific circumstances in order to work out. While its DPS isn't super competitive, doing 45% more total than Star Eater Nova while taking over 9 times longer to cast, it's still one of the most versatile supers in the game in terms of what it provides players in both solo and team content. Next up, we have Twilight Arsenal. Now, this one's apparently getting a buff next reset, so I won't pass judgment too harshly on it. Once that buff is out, I'll probably make a YouTube short or something discussing its viability, but let's talk about today. Twilight Arsenal is somewhat of a burst super, given its short cast time, and so its competition is going to consist of Cura's Thunder Crash and Pyrogale Burning Maul. We've compared these two supers before, and I've come out and said that Thunder Crash is much more consistent, especially because it doesn't require any buffs like Roaring Flames or the sacrifice of the Consecration aspect that is generally associated with neutral Pyrogale gameplay. On top of that, Thunder Crash works on pretty much all boss models, while Burning Maul definitely has consistency issues when it comes to doing the same damage on different boss heights and shapes. Numerically, Thunder Crash is much higher DPS thanks to its much faster cast time, but as a result of Prismatic, even total damage has shifted in Thunder Crash's favor, sitting at just over 800k with Facet of Courage. Previously, Pyrogales had slightly higher total damage if the conditions were right, but now since Prismatic Titan doesn't have access to Burning Maul or Roaring Flames, Curious has taken the top spot when it comes to burst super DPS on Titan. But what about Twilight Arsenal? In terms of total damage, it does around 960k with Star Eaters, and DPS wise it's better than Pyrogale but worse than Curious. So where does this super fit in for Titans? The fact that it has the ability to not only deal respectable damage to longer range targets, but also weaken at a distance is something that is most certainly valuable to have against bosses like the Witness. Well, what about the axes? Well, as for the raw values, the heavy attack does around 93k, while the light attacks do around 27k each. In terms of DPS, is it actually worth picking these up and using them during damage? Well, that's what we have our swap tab for. Contrary to what I've been told by some people, these relics do not interact with buffs, surges, or any sort of exotic armor. In terms of their actual raw damage, light attack spam with the axes does around 41k DPS, while picking up an axe and immediately chucking it does around 63k. Not great, but if you need to refresh the weaken on a boss, not a horrible idea to grab one and throw it quickly. Storm's Edge is up next. While this super's total damage is decent at just shy of 1.2 million, it's not really a realistic super to use for boss damage as it has 3 separate casts that all have their own windup and recovery animations. On top of that, you have to throw your knife near the boss so you can hit your spin attack, which means some bosses are kind of out of the question compared to something more universal like Gathering Storm or Golden Gun. However, given that each spin does around 400k damage, if you manage to integrate it into some kind of rotation where you shoot something like a rocket or something high burst between each knife, it might not be awful, especially given that its swap DPS sits at around 145k, which is actually higher than something like Star Eater Song of Flame. However, we need to keep in mind that something like Song of Flame exists on a class without Nighthawk, and that it provides a whole host of benefits that the Storm's Edge doesn't. So does Storm's Edge stack up against Celestial? Plain and simple, no. While Celestial does about 80% of the damage Storm's Edge does, the difference in DPS is so massive that Storm's Edge is basically not worth ever considering, especially in the context of today's Still Hunt focused meta. Now that we've talked about the 3 newest additions to the Destiny super roster, let's talk about supers as a whole, class by class. First on the list we have Titan supers, which I've split into 3 categories: total damage, burst damage, and bad. In the total damage category, we have Syntho Banner Blade Fury at 1.45 million, Star Eater Glacial Quake at 3.7 million, and Syntho Roaring Hammer of Soul at 1.43 million. These 3 supers all kind of have different roles. Glacial Quake is really only good on massive grounded targets, but happens to be attached to Prismatic if you want to use Star Eaters, meaning your neutral build can actually be quite flexible. Blade Fury and Hammer of Soul are both similar in total damage, but both are essentially just supers you pick because of the subclass they're attached to. These 3 supers are generally not that relevant for optimized boss damage scenarios outside of Riven, where Glacial Quake outdamages even surrounded Caraxes. So let's move on to supers that are more relevant for burst. We already touched on these before, but to reiterate, I'd say that Twilight Arsenal is generally the most safely applicable damage super for Titans now, since unlike Thunder Crash, you can use it at any range and it has higher DPS than Pyrogales. In the context of the other 2 classes, Twilight Arsenal still greatly underperforms at a swap DPS value of 252k compared to the 757k and 1.15 million that Star Eater Nova and pre-pop Celestial Goldie have. That being said, it's nice that Titans have a usable range super that isn't horrible for DPS now, and hopefully Act 2's buff will leave it a little bit more potent. Finally, we have bad Titan supers. Not much to say about these since I think it's fairly obvious why they don't really have a place in the boss DPS meta at the moment. Fist of Havoc is just really awful DPS, while Ward of Dawn provides the same buff as Radiant Orbs, Well of Radiance, and Song of Flame, but doesn't allow shooting through its barrier. Sentinel Shield does provide a 40% buff, but I'm sure everyone knows by now that we aren't really in a sandbox where blocking projectiles in exchange for losing damage against something like a Well's 25% buff to all players is worth it. Enough talk about Titan. Let's talk about Warlock next. For Warlocks, I've split the supers into 4 categories: total damage, burst damage, utility, and bad. For total damage, Warlocks don't really have anything besides Star Eater Song of Flame, but in my opinion, the fact that you only do about 45% more damage than a Star Eater Nova, while taking way longer to do so, really makes this super a hard sell for total damage in general. So what about burst damage? Well, last season it was all about Needlestorm and Threat of Ascent rotations. This season we now have access to the coveted 70% super damage boost that was Hunter exclusive before now, and it's available on both of the potential powerhouse super candidates, Cataclysm Nova and Needlestorm. There's one small problem though. While Threat of Evolution Needlestorm on Broodweaver does about 11% more than Cataclysm Nova at base, Prismatic Warlock doesn't have Threat of Evolution. To make matters worse, for whatever reason, Needlestorm only gets 35% of the 70% benefit that Star Eater normally provides, while Nova gets the full amount. And the final nail in the coffin, of course, is that Needlestorm is a darkness ability, meaning that it doesn't receive the free 10% from Facet of Courage that Nova has access to. All 3 of these factors result in a Nova Bomb dominated DPS meta, with it towering over Star Eater Needlestorm's damage by a whopping 38%, despite both supers having similar cast times. A shame, since I would have liked to see the numbers a bit closer, with Needlestorm having the benefit of not blocking shots, while Nova is a bit better at single target focus, given that its projectiles have less spread issues. I've also added a utility category here, since supers like Well and Song of Flame are obviously not bad, but obviously not for raw damage if used for a team benefit. Well is still a good source of free gradient for 30 seconds with a lingering 8 seconds afterward, and tier 2 restoration and 10% boss DR is still enough for most instances. Song of Flame, the new kid on the block, provides much more DR at 30%, gives your allies ability regen, scorching rounds, and of course gives you radiant. This season, thanks to Radiant Orbs, Radiant isn't hard to come by even during damage without a Well, but it's still a nice to have so you don't really have to think about it. Finally, the bad supers. Daybreak, Nova Warp, Storm Trance, Chaos Reach, and Winter's Wrath. Even with Star Eaters available to some of these supers, their damage output is pretty bad, even with their associated exotics like Dawn Chorus for Daybreak, Geomags for Chaos Reach, and Balladors for Winter's Wrath. And unlike Titan, none of these supers provide any sort of utility like Sentinel Shield or Ward of Dawn Might, so there's not much else to discuss here. Hunter supers are next on the menu. For total damage, Hunters don't have much besides one option, which is Star Eater Silk Strike, coming in at just under 1.4 million. The closest comparison to this would be Roaring Syntho's Hammer of Soul at 1.43 million, however this super takes way less time to dish out its damage, resulting in a swap DPS value that actually matches Star Eater Mobius Quiver, but for a much higher total damage value. That being said, it's still a measly 142k in the grand scheme of things, which is lower than any optimal DPS weapon rotation, so this is more of a backup damage option to pad out your rotation rather than a main squeeze. So what about actual DPS? Well, Hunters have been known as the damage super specialists for quite a while now, and while Warlocks have certainly made their case, Hunters of course still have Celestial Nighthawk Golden Gun, which remains as the highest burst DPS super in the game given its instant single instance of damage, as well as Star Eater Blade Barrage, which is also pretty potent on the right targets. There's only a 14% difference in damage between the two currently, so the vast majority of the time it makes much more sense to go with the Goldie. Next, we have a label that I didn't think really applied to any of the other two classes supers, but does apply to Hunter. There's a few Hunter supers that have objectively decent damage, but just aren't really relevant for boss damage in the grand scheme of things. Gathering Storm and Storm's Edge are both decent supers, but they're really only used because they're attached to Arcstrider. These days, everything Arcstrider does, Prismatic does better, and if you're on Prismatic, people tend to use Golden Gun, both for damage and for Facet of Purpose restoration. However, there's one more super that I want to talk about in this category, and it's as a result of the shatter damage changes to bosses, as well as a small buff it received with the Final Shape patch. And that super is Silence and Squall. Interestingly, Nighthawk Goldie only does about 19% more damage than Star Eater Squall, even if Squall does have a longer cast time. The reason I bring this up is because while Prismatic Hunter is obviously very strong for damage, I'm interested in the potential of abusing Whisper of Impetus for new Hunter damage rotations, and the fact that Celestial still works with Still Hunt even if you don't have Golden Gun equipped, plus Squall's new damage values, means Revenant damage has become just that much more interesting. Like Warlocks, Hunters have two usable utility supers, Deadfall Tether and Mobius Quiver. The former is a decent option for a full 30% debuff against ranged bosses where Tractor doesn't make sense, which is a very rare occurrence these days, but obviously it does no damage. The latter is used in some niche scenarios where you need a 30% debuff, but also value a little bit of damage on top. However, given how little damage this super does in the grand scheme of things, sitting at 136k DPS and 610k damage, it's really fallen out of favor in most situations, especially now that Prismatic Hunter has consistent weaken options through Transcendent Melee Recharge. The last group of supers we're going to talk about are the bad supers on Hunter. These consist of Deadshot Golden Gun, Arc Staff, and Spectral Blades. I don't think I really need to talk much about these because they're irredeemable for boss damage in pretty much every way, and I don't think most people will contest that fact. Just wanted to cover all my bases. Now that we've spent a good chunk of time discussing supers, it's finally time to talk about a different ability. Thankfully, grenades are a lot simpler than supers. I'll show you all of them here, but just know that most of them are pretty bad, and by that I mean they are straight downgrades from decent special weapons when it comes to damage. So instead, let's look at the bright side of things and focus only on the notable ones. Out of the 3 prismatic grenades, only really Hailfire Spike is good, ranking 5th of all the non-Verity grenades when it comes to swap DPS. The other 2 prismatic grenades are frankly pretty bad, with sub 100k DPS numbers. As for your regular grenades, there are only 5 or 6 that I'd like to talk about. In order from highest to lowest swap DPS, we have Sunbracer's Touch Ash Solar Grenades, Void Walls with Remnants, Touch Magnitude Shock Pulse and Storm Grenades, Ash's Thermite Grenades, and Touch Ash's Fusion Grenades. Surprisingly, even when stacked together, Sunbracer's Touch Solar Grenades do pretty massive swap DPS at nearly 230k, which is up there with even some heavy weapons. Now obviously solar grenades aren't great on every boss. These results were obtained by throwing these grenades under Templar as the ritual animation was completing, so that he'd sink on top of them for maximum lava glob contact. On most bosses that move around and have less spherical hitboxes, solar grenades will likely do less than you expect. What's curious is that this test was actually done by throwing 4 consecutive grenades using 1 Sunbracer's activation, and it still managed to outdamage every other grenade in the game, despite what people say about DOT stacking. I'm curious about this subject in particular, and at some point in the future, I'll be investigating how well DOT effects actually stack in Destiny, from grenades to Bleak Watchers to Dragon's Breath. Sunbracers aside, Void Walls and Thermites were also a surprising entry in the top DPS grenades. I'll have to investigate how well they stack, but obviously these grenades aren't the most applicable to every boss as well. As expected, Pulse Grenades and Storm Grenades both perform great on Striker Titan, with Pulses doing slightly more damage per grenade and slightly higher DPS as a result. I would also argue that Pulses have less RNG with how the roaming Storm decides to track to the boss and hit it with every lightning bolt. Finally, a note on Touch Fusion Grenades. A lot of people have historically respected Starfire Fusions for DPS, but looking at their standing in this list, their swap DPS is lower than 7 other non-Verity options. 100k swap DPS isn't particularly good, even if the burst or true DPS on fusions is a little bit better than most grenades, which are often more DOT based. To sum things up, grenades aren't really great for DPS this patch, although I will be experimenting with grenade DPS rotations when I make the rotation ranking video for this season. They're really to pad out your total damage by applying some sort of DOT effect, like weaken or jolt, rather than being your main source of damage outside of a few exceptions. When you choose to throw a grenade, most of the time you are lowering your overall DPS during that time period compared to a typical special or heavy weapon. Melees are up next. Now, melees have been particularly powerful in the past few years of Destiny, from broken throwing hammers to shield bash to banner of war grapple melees. Let's talk about some of the melees that are topping the charts this season. Now, the question that's on everyone's mind is, of course, how good is the new kid on the block? And by that I mean, just how good are Stylish Executioner grapple melees now that Hunter has access to biotic enhancements? And the answer is pretty good. Let's compare the damage of one grapple melee from Hunter to Titan. Right now, grapple melees range from 411k to 1.07 million per melee, from banner synthos to stylish synthos. Comparing them, one Hunter stylish syntho grapple melee does 51% more than a pre-nerf max stack Worm God banner grapple melee, 93% more than post-nerf Worm Gods, and 161% more than post-nerf synthos. Of course, this comes with a caveat. Stylish Executioner needs to be active, meaning that you need to kill an enemy with your 1-2 punch shotgun to go invisible, and then grapple within the small grace period in which grappling does not break your invisibility. Thanks to the 2 stylish internal cooldown, it is impossible to spam grapple melees at the same speed as you can on Titan, but the per melee damage has gone up significantly as we've discussed. Certainly an interesting change in direction for the melee meta, but I wouldn't be surprised if Bungie patches stylish buffing grapple melees, given that a single grapple melee with proper setup does more damage than a fully buffed Celestial Nighthawk Golden Gun. Grapple melees aside, let's talk about some other interesting melees that have been brought up for discussion. Consecration with Worm God Caress and Knockout now does 756k a pop, although it's not as spammable as grapple melee and has 3 charges compared to the essentially infinite loop that Berserker has access to. As a result, the swap DPS of such a consecration sits at around 285k, which is still pretty respectable, but not as broken as what was discussed prior. Plenty of people have asked me what I think of the new Wishful Ignorance Titan exotic, and while it does seem like an alright neutral option that doesn't require multiple enemies surrounding you, the fact that even after 4 slashes and no Banner of War melee bonus reduction, it still does less per slash than Synthos tells you all you need to know. The melee regen is apparently 30% per pulse in a raid fire team of 6, which is okay, but in my opinion that's still not really enough to place this above Syntheseps in most situations. Next, we have Peregrine boosted Shield Bash with Bastion. Now, in the recent past, Peregrines weren't really used as much because 1-2 Punch's activation timer was too fast to use with this armor exotic. However, Bastion Saint's Fist perk lasts just long enough that you can activate the perk by hitting a bunch of your bolts, start sprinting and jumping, and hit your Shield Bash right as the melee buff is about to run out. Now, while the damage of this single melee is pretty decent at 668k, the fact that this loop takes over 5 seconds to execute really takes it down a notch to a mere 130k DPS. Definitely a cool playstyle for roam content where a single target burst matters like in GMs, but for boss DPS, that's a non-starter. Not to beat a dead horse, but I was also curious about base grapple melee damage. Like if you just make a navigator grapple point and then just spam grapple melees with a 1-2 punch shotgun with no buffs whatsoever, what's your DPS? Well, it turns out it's about 90k. For reference, that's about the same DPS as shooting Vorpal Cartesian Coordinate repeatedly in a well. That's not too bad. Finally, I wanted to talk about Combination Blow with Liar's Handshake. Surprisingly, even though Liar's combo outpaces Syntho's combo in terms of 1-2 punch DPS, the DPS of both strategies is quite low at 71k and 69k respectively. So if you want to do DPS on Combination Blow Hunter, you're probably better off sticking with regular weapons unless you're really in a pinch. As for some of the other melees I didn't mention here, like Thunderclap, Shield Bash without Bastion, and Lightning Surge, I'll probably touch on these more in build crafting adjacent videos rather than in this one, since this video is focused on boss DPS. As you can see, none of them are really competitive for boss DPS, but they could be interesting in the context of more roam-focused content. Last but, well, they are kind of least, but we have tick sources, or some people call them buddies. Of course, I'm referring to Hellion, Arcsoul, Bleakwatcher, and to some degree, Jolt and Unravel. I've received a ton of comments from you guys praising Prismatic Warlock for its ability to have 3 helpers alongside you during damage, and so I've decided to try my best to quantify how much these damage sources actually do for you during boss DPS. To keep things short, Hellion does almost the same DPS whether you have Facet of Courage or Ember of Ashes going, and that's right around 23k, which is essentially the same as a Witherhoard stick. This of course assumes that every ignition is yours and not one of your teammates, but we'll get to stacking values in a future video like I mentioned before. Arcsoul does significantly less at around 15k if you're amplified, or 6.5k otherwise, which is a rather substantial drop. Finally, a Bleak Watcher does around 12k DPS with Facet of Ruin if you manually shatter the boss rather than letting it occur on its own. This one was a little tricky to test, but essentially I shot Microcosm for an extended period, then did it again with a turret down next to Templar, and calculated the difference between the two tests. As for the last two subclass effects, Jolt does around 6.5k DPS assuming constant damage being done to the boss to activate it at max rate, and Unravel does around 3.8k. Individually, these sources do very little DPS, in fact they make up the bottom 7 entries on the Sustain tab. However, what if you combine them? Say you summoned your Hellion, used Getaway to overcharge your grenade and throw a Bleak Watcher while spawning an Amplified Arc Soul, and then you unravel the boss using an Arcane Needle and then started doing damage afterward. Well, you'd be getting an additional nearly 53k DPS on top of whatever you're doing with your weapons. Granted, this additional layer of DPS only lasts until these buddies expire, which is about 20 seconds, but that's about 1 million extra damage over the course of that time. And on top of that, 53k DPS is better than the DPS that sticking a boss with 2 Anarchy Traps does, which is around 46k, even if shooting 2 Anarchy is a lot faster than the setup that this requires. Regardless, these calculations do make me a lot more interested in Prismatic Warlock rotations, especially for solo content, and I'm excited to see what we can cook up for the rotation ranking video later this season. To summarize things, what have we learned about the ability sandbox in today's meta? Well, for Titan Supers, I think Twilight Arsenal is a bit of a meta shift against Kira's Thundercrash, especially in anticipation of next week's buff, given how easy it is to use and how flexible it is against a variety of boss scenarios. For Hunter, not much has changed super-wise besides a new subclass to use Nighthawk with, and for Warlock, Song of Flame makes a strong case for itself for team play as a consistent long-term DR source with built-in ability regen and Scorching Rounds, while Star Eater Nova has completely replaced Needlestorm with its absolutely insane 1 million plus total damage. For your other abilities, there's really only one standout performance. Grenades are generally pretty lackluster, with the vast majority of them underperforming against more traditional DPS methods. Although Sunbracer solar grenades did surprise me with how well they scale up with many of them ticking, most grenades just weren't up to par when it comes to being a main damage source rather than a supplemental one. Melees on the other hand did take an interesting turn. Hunters have now taken the melee damage meta by storm, with Stylish Syntho grapple melees outdoing Banner of War Worm God grapple melees by nearly double the per melee damage, even if they are restricted by an internal cooldown. That being said, I think Titan grapple melees will likely still be viable for some content, albeit taking a strong nerf to their damage output in the final shape patch. And finally, as for tick sources, I can confidently say that they certainly provide some excellent total damage buffing in solo content, where no one else is going to interfere with your shatter, ignition, or unravel damage. In terms of group damage, I'll be testing more on that scaling in a future project, but for now this has made me more excited for the possibilities that we now have for Warlock DPS crafting in the future. A few of you were asking for my opinions on exotic class items and what roles are relevant for DPS. Rest assured that when the rotation video arrives, all your questions will be answered, and I'll continue to do testing behind the scenes on interesting combos like Hoyle Verity for grenade DPS, Dragon Coyote for Magdump style rotations, and Star Eater Apotheosis for Warlock in particular. Speaking of exotic class items, if you want to start your collection so you can test some of the many combinations yourself, my friend, a 2016 Toyota Corolla, has recently released his very efficient Pale Heart chest farming macro, which I found to be very helpful, given that dual destiny double drops have been patched, and there's no recourse when it comes to farming the 1 in 64 that you might want. Well, that's all for now, everyone. Rest assured that I do read every single one of your comments, and those of you that have been pleading for hazardous propulsion testing for Titan solo rotations will get your wish. If you have any other ideas for damage rotations, feel free to leave them in the comments as usual. I hope you learned something or at least got some confirmation from some of the numbers in this video, and I'll see you in the next one, which will be a return to Ergos Zoom testing. Later!